Race in Latin America. The concept of race is understood in highly variable ways in Latin America. Standard ideas about race typically recognize three distinct categories: Black, White, and Indian. The term Black has referred to Africans brought to Latin America as slaves and their descendants. White refers to European colonists who conquered and settled the region and their descendants. Finally, Indians refers to the indigenous or native population that inhabited the region before European conquest. A key additional feature of race in Latin America is the idea of mestizage or mestiçismo, mixture in Spanish and Portuguese, respectively, which refers to the biological and cultural blending among these three populations. The colonial period. The process of racial mixture in Latin America began with European colonization in the 15th century. The mixture differed between regions because of distinct indigenous groups, the goals of colonists, and the practice of enslavement. Before the European conquest, indigenous Latin American civilizations were quite varied. Indigenous groups included the Inca and Aztec empires, which each had their own densely settled cities. However, there were also mobile hunting and gathering cultures scattered throughout the region. Indigenous populations shrunk post-European arrival because of new diseases and poor treatment by Europeans. Still, larger groups at the time of contact generally remained large. In these cases, most notably in the Central Andes and in central Mexico, Spanish colonists enslaved native peoples. In other areas such as Brazil, Cuba, and Colombia, Portuguese and Spanish colonists enslaved and forcibly brought in large numbers of African people. Mixing between Europeans, Africans, and indigenous peoples started almost immediately upon contact. The offspring of mixed unions were recognized as socially distinct from their parents. The term mestizo referred to people of mixed indigenous and European heritage, while mulatto referred to a person of African and European descent. Zambo, meanwhile, was the term for a person with Black and indigenous heritage. Spanish colonists attempted to systematize a hierarchy or ranking of socio-racial classes, known as a sociedade de castas, or society of castes. Portuguese colonists were less concerned with this kind of classification. In all cases, mixture occurred in a setting in which Europeans were socially, economically, and militarily dominant. Europeans were able to exploit Black and indigenous labor and enforce cultural changes, such as the introduction of Christianity. However, many Black and indigenous people resisted colonial powers. They mounted many rebellions, and large numbers escaped to distant settlements outside of European control. Post-colonial society. By the mid-19th century, most Latin American countries were independent republics and had abolished slavery, except for Brazil, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Slavery continued in these three areas until the 1880s. Elites wanted to define their new nation's identities in a positive light. However, the mixed nature of their populations made this hard. At this point in history, many European cultures held wrong and untrue beliefs about the inferiority of people of color. Around the turn of the 20th century, some Latin Americans responded to this problem with the theory of progressive mixture. This theory admitted that the national populations of Latin America were mixed, but also assumed that the region was moving toward a state of increasing whiteness. Many countries encouraged European immigration to hasten this theoretical process of blanqueamiento, or whitening. Elites in countries with large indigenous populations, like Mexico, became quite contradictory in their beliefs and practices. They tended to glorify the indigenous past, while still discriminating against indigenous people and hoping for a whiter future. Many Latin American intellectuals tried to distance themselves from Euro-American theories of race. They asserted that mixture had created a tolerant society in which racism was not an issue and biology had little influence on identities. This image of racial democracy was made in direct contrast to the racial segregation of the United States and persisted into the 21st century. In everyday practice, Latin American ideas about race continued to play an important role. In Brazil, for example, major racial inequality still exists and there is continuing discrimination against Black Brazilians. Throughout many parts of Latin American societies and cultures, there are still ideas about the superiority of whiteness and the inferiority of Black and indigenous identities. Redefining national identities. In the late 20th century, several Latin American countries redefined their national identities. They moved away from ideas of blanqueamiento and toward an official recognition and celebration of cultural and ethnic diversity. This was partly in response to indigenous and Black political activism. In these countries, people are now categorized not by race, but in terms of their ethnicity, although the same basic categories, Black, White, Indian, still remain. These developments have strengthened claims to certain rights that are tied to ethnicity, most importantly, rights to land. Although indigenous peoples have long had special land reserves in many parts of Latin America, it was only at the turn of the 21st century that the possibility of Black communities applying for reserve land emerged. The impact of these developments on Latin American ideas of race is not clear. The new emphasis on multiculturalism has increased the visibility of Black and indigenous peoples within Latin American societies. However, it remains unclear how much it will help to improve their social, economic, and political position.